Shalom, everybody. Good morning. I am battling a little bit of laryngitis, so you'll have to forgive me that I am amplified, but it doesn't mean that my voice is more important than yours. It just means that I wanted you to be able to hear me, and that if, in particular, our folks on Zoom, good morning, friends, good Shabbos, wanted them to be able to hear me as well. So, two quick words about me. Hi, I'm Rabbi Dan Horwitz. I am currently the executive director of Midwest States for Jewish National Fund, USA. So I get to spend my day raising dollars for projects in the north and south of Israel, helping those communities rebuild in the aftermath of October 7th. But I have a varied professional career. I have been a corporate attorney for a hot moment, doing mergers and acquisitions, which I absolutely despised. But I'm most recently the CEO of the Jewish Federation in Nashville, Tennessee. I've been a large synagogue, 900 family conservative synagogue pulpit rabbi at a Dat Shalom synagogue in Detroit. I was the CEO of a large JCC in the first year of COVID in Miami, Florida. I worked for Moishe House, which is an organization that works with young Jewish adults in their 20s, as one of the original 10 employees. And for 5+ years, I had the privilege of building my own organization in Metro Detroit called The Well, which kind of served as a JCC without walls for young adults and young families. So my specialty, so to speak, is working with young adults and young families and acquiring student debt, which I'm very, very good at. I ended up with 3 master's degrees, a law degree in rabbinic ordination, and a lot of student debt. But it's a privilege to be here. And you should know that Rabbi Foster is one of my best friends in the entire world. We grew up together in Detroit, went to Jewish day school together, grades 1 through 8. His father, may he rest in peace, is the one who taught us how to play bridge when we were in 7th grade for some crazy reason. And we went on to play bridge every day for the better part of 5 years. Josh and I have played bridge together on 4 continents. And I was one of the rabbis at his wedding, and he one of the rabbis at mine. And Ezra and Leora held my hands this morning as we walked to shul. So, which just made me feel really great because I haven't seen them in far too long. So thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be here with you all. So I want to think a little bit about clothing, and it's only because it's frigid outside this morning. But we're at this interesting place in the Torah where we've kind of gone, we can't know when looking at any given parsha where we are until we think about where we've come from, okay? And sometimes, as we know, the Torah's narrative doesn't go chronologically as much as we might like to think that it could, would, or should, right? So the Israelites have left Egypt, right? They've received the 10 commandments. We just got a whole bunch of instructions last week on building the Mishkan, the portable tabernacle, this wandering sanctuary, if you will, right? And now all of a sudden we're getting, and it's funny, we think usually about the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, as being the book that focuses on the priests and the priestly code, right? If you subscribe to what in academia they call the documentary hypothesis, which is that there were probably 4 unique authors to the Torah, and then those books were woven together to combine what we now consider our 5 books of Moses. If you subscribe to that theory, the book of Leviticus is usually ascribed to a priest specifically, and the book deals overwhelmingly with the priesthood. But it's interesting that we're getting a lot of instructions now around the priests, less about their duties, although that too, but a lot about their clothing here in the book of Exodus, and towards the end of the book of Exodus and Shemot, okay? So one of the things that I'm really excited for us, and I'm gonna jump ahead because I think it bookends it nicely, but one of my favorite Mark Twain quotes of all time, you find at the very back of this packet, which is, "Clothes make the man. Naked people have very little or no influence on society." And Mr. Twain, or Samuel Clemens, if you prefer, that always made me giggle whenever I read that quote. But I wanted to kind of think about it, because so much of the way that we perceive one another, the way we think about Jewish practice in life, for better or worse, a lot of it actually revolves around dress. It can be not only what we're wearing, we dress the Torah up, right? We have this concept of hidur mitzvah, beautifying mitzvot that we're going to be fulfilling. We dress our Torahs up. They have silver and gold and covers and special covers for the high holidays and, you know, all that kind of fun stuff. So we find this concept of dress returning throughout our tradition. But most importantly, were any of us born with clothing? No. Will someone read this first text for us from Genesis? Please.
The two of them were naked, the human and his wife, yet they felt no shame.
All right. So obviously we're talking about Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve in this construct, right? It comes from Genesis 2. You may recall in the book of Genesis, there are two creation narratives, right? There's Genesis chapter 1, where man is created on the sixth day. And there's Genesis chapter 2, where mankind is created at the front end, and then man's wife is taken from his rib while he's sleeping. That's Genesis 2. Some would argue that's two completely different stories that were both included. But in either case, they came about, and the idea was there was no clothing, right? There's, I think for me, you know, there's a line that I use often at baby namings now, that just because the world is such a crazy place and we really don't know with our kids what to expect, the line is something along the lines of, though your naked self is being entrusted to our care, much of your truth has yet to be revealed. And there's something about this vulnerability of coming out in our birthday suits, if you will, and then thinking about clothing. But some of those decisions we make right away, oh, is it blue? Is it pink? Is it, you know, all of these kinds of things. And sometimes life unfolds, right? But in any case, one of the first things that we're inclined to do is to clothe our children, right? When we think about our morning blessings, we praise God who clothes the naked, right? Mal bisharomim. When we think about what is it that we're aspiring to do, certainly in colder weather climates like we have here in the Midwest, Lord knows we think about, you know, coat drives and things of this, and we're itching to help people stay warm, to not be vulnerable in that way, and to be protected. And yeah.
It may be that the concept of clothing only applies to this world, because there is this expression and this concept that naked I came to this world, and naked I will go out of this world.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. So there's a question, there's the concept of clothing is really only meant to be applied to this world. And I would take that even a step further and suggest that if the Garden of Eden is meant to be our vision or version of paradise, and that we were cast out of that garden, and that we aspire for Olam Haba, the world to come, and that it's going to be Eden-esque in terms of what that Olam Haba is meant to be. We were naked in the Garden of Eden until the sin of eating from the apple, right? Eating from the tree. And then they're aware of their nakedness, and that's only when clothing is demanded, right? And frankly, if you look at little kids running around, they are more than happy to run around naked out, right? Like, it's not even a question. And sometimes it's better because you don't have to change their messy clothes, right?
It's also more natural, really, sometimes for kids.
Mm-hmm.
It's also bringing up, I like that the phrase naked selves is that you said, like, stuck with me. It's not just a vulnerability, but to me, there's also a purity and authenticness. Is that a word? Authenticity. Thank you. I'm like, that's not the noun. Authenticity to nakedness, which resonates to me very much in lines with Purim, right? Because we talk about our hidden identities, Esther's hidden identity, and all of these things. And so what clothing covers up for us, and this desire, back to your Olam Haba, world to come, Gan Eden concept, right? That we should be able to live in the fullness of our identities and our true authentic selves. I
love it. So you stole thunder, but in a good way. No, because we're going to look at a bunch of stuff. And Nelson, I'm going to get you in 1 second. You point out and you tie, and there's a reason that this really works beautifully and that we're so close in proximity to Purim, which begins this Thursday evening, not only in terms of what we're hiding in Esther, but you think about the role that clothing plays in the Purim story. There are at least two significant interactions that immediately come to mind for me. The first is Achashverosh demanding that Vashti strip down in order to go and dance for the people who are attending his feast. And the second is when Achashverosh asks Haman, boo. When Achashverosh asks Haman, what would you do in order to honor somebody who was held in really high regard? And Haman, thinking of himself, he says, I would dress him in the king's robes, right? And then ultimately Mordecai gets dressed in those robes and gets to go paraded on horseback down the street. Beautiful. We'll come back to Purim on the back end. Yes, hand up, Nelson, please.
I'm in South Florida, and we need clothes down here to protect us from the sun. So it's protect us from the weather. It doesn't necessarily from the cold. But there's
Fair
a
enough.
problem that clothes pose for us that nakedness doesn't. It covers over our gender. And a lot of what we want to do in life is reveal our gender. And so we wear special clothes. Men and women wear slightly different clothes. So you can tell by looking at the clothes, their gender. And that probably lends itself also to other things like military uniforms and the like.
Interesting. Thank you.
Not today, though.
So maybe less so today, where folks wear gender nonconforming clothes, or they wear what's comfortable, or there's
Cross-dresser.
Sure. Cool. All right. Now let's look at the piece of text that's going to be kind of, yeah, please.
I saw something also in the Purim story. He dresses up Esther. Because she's the one that took a year to makeup, and I imagine makeup would be included in part of our clothing. And so that's interesting. Stripping Vashti, but yet Esther is in her finest to meet him.
For sure. And one of the kids call them memes, right? Like, but one of the images that has been circulating on social media in the last couple of weeks is that there was a recent event where Kanye West, Ymach Shmo, was with his spouse, and his spouse was wearing an outfit that was leaving absolutely nothing to the imagination, and and someone was like, oh, it's Purim. And it was like, this is what it must have been like with Achashverosh and Vashti demanding that his wife go and parade herself in front of the masses, which I thought was just an interesting take. All right, so in this week's Parsha, we're diving in. There's a number of instructions that we find, but the one verse that I really want us to focus in on is verse 2 in chapter 28. It's here on the page. If you wanted to see it in Eitz Chaim, it's at the top of page 505, just so you know. Does someone want to read this one for us, please?
Make sacred vestments for your brother Aaron for dignity and adornment.
Beautiful. So if you're the rabbi, we're the rabbis now, okay? Here's the instruction. I think it's important to look at the Hebrew too. So sacred, kodesh, right? Holy. Make holy clothing for Aaron, your brother, and then the translation here is dignity and adornment, but kavod is like honor. Often we would translate it, right? Tiferet is kind of like higher level glory, if you will, right? So always have to be careful when we're looking at English and we're trying to parse words, because checking out the Hebrew and the Hebrew roots is really important there. Good. If you were the rabbis in this case, you saw this instruction, what would your first question be? Why? Good. Other questions? Just from one short verse, what other questions come to mind? What kind of vestments? Good. Why are we doing this? What kind of vestments specifically are we talking about? Good. What else?
How not to worship Aaron like we were supposed to worship God is what's coming to me right now.
Amazing. So all of a sudden we have holy clothing going on, my brother, and how are we going to prevent people from bowing down to this? Right? Good. What else? We've had golden calf moments shimmering, right?
Bringing it back. Now, the outside instead of the inside.
Interesting. Nice. So honoring outside is
I'm thinking, why would you put on these fancy schmancy clothes when you're gonna be all messed up in blood and animal guts?
right. So don't forget, and that's my sermon this morning, by the way, so not to steal too much thunder, is how the priests were effectively the barbecue pitmasters of their time. right? So we have all of these fancy schmancy vests and we have to sprinkle the blood here and there and burn the fat this and whatever. So this is fancy garmentry for the barbecue pit.
And also, to distinguish the priests, to sort of give them an aura of holiness, you know, it creates a hierarchical element here. This is the first time we're seeing the, you know, I mean, the priesthood is developing here in Leviticus, and it's a feature of their authority.
Good, nice, thank you, Adam. So we're distinguishing the priests and setting them aside in a different way. The clothing helps mark them that way, right? Good. What other questions? Any other questions? Well, the ones that we're
Why
going to
me?
focus on. Yeah, please.
No, I mean, I'm a priest. I'm not a tailor. Why me? Are you telling me to do it, or are you telling me to see that it's done? This is the book for priests, not the book for tailors.
Interesting, good, I love it. So that's a great question that Nelson's raising. This is God giving the instruction to Moses, right? So God is saying, make these vestments. And Moses is like, I'm not the tailor Matzal Tamzoil. Like, what are you talking about? This is not necessarily my skill set. Is it for me specifically Moses to do, or do I get to farm this work out to artisans? Good, great question. And then the other question that I would pose, and we're going to talk about that. Oh, Shira, you have a hand up? Sorry.
Yes, and it's also, how does wearing these clothes change you on the inside?
Beautiful.
What is
So
the emotion of being dressed like this?
It's a service. Yeah.
He doesn't.
The other room.
Like I do the Zoom here.
I love it. So good. But the other question that I want us to dive into this morning is, what do we mean by kavod and tifaret, for dignity and adornment, or for honor and glory? What do those things actually mean substantively? And that's what I've pulled a number of commentaries on that we'll have a chance to dive into this morning. Yeah.
Basically, it's something different from every day.
Yeah. Nice.
In other words, don't wear your everyday clothes.
Good.
Just like on Shabbos, we say, you're supposed to get dressed for Shabbos. Don't come like a plumber.
We're actually going to look at that text in a minute too. Right? Shabbos best. Good. I like it. Yeah.
So, I don't know, I guess if we look at the Shoresh, the kavod is like kaved, it's honor in the sense of weightiness, or
because kaved also
we
means
want to
heavy.
look at it from maybe from the point of view of gravity. Wearing these clothes bends space better than not wearing these clothes.
Nice.
Or that implies that Aaron should take his responsibility seriously, right? Like the weight of that.
I like the idea that Ivan mentioned, that it gives them really an aura. It makes a lot of sense to me that, you know, it should be different than every day.
Nice.
Yeah, also, in contrast to the prophet Moses in this context, who was not mentioned in this parsha, right? The prophet has has a great, a personality, a charismatic personality, as opposed to the priest. And but what happens, and Jonathan Sachs does a whole thing about this. You probably have read his essay on this, that what happens when the charismatic person is gone, like Moses leaves, and then they build the golden calf. So you have to have the priest that represents, the daily activity that is not necessarily charismatic. How do you sustain that charisma? And dressing the priests the way they're being dressed is one way of enhancing that a status that goes with their job and their presence.
Nice. And I like that construct in terms of the leadership in generations that followed. And with respect to Rabbi Sachs, the one thing I would challenge him on is that when I think about Moses's leadership, I don't know that I would describe it as charismatic. I think it was humble servant leadership, but he wasn't the person at the front of the room speaking. It was actually Aaron, his brother, who was at the front of the room speaking, courtesy of Moses's speech impediment. So I think that in subsequent generations, when you think about the role of prophet versus priest, that makes more sense to me than at least in this initial context as we're establishing the priesthood.
Maybe getting ahead of myself or ahead of the class. Once we were in the cathedral and we went in the back room, nobody was there, we were getting a tour. And we saw all the clothes for the priests. We think we wear different clothes. I mean, they took this all very literally. Different color kippot, different ornaments. They go and change all day long. They got it from here, obviously, but they kept it.
So there's a lot that other.
And we actually, as Jews, have gone in the opposite. We try to wear the suit with the talit, and that's it, and a head covering. I mean.
And there's a lot of confusion too about who are we as everyday Jews meant to be, right? Because we say, oh, we're meant to be, you know, a nation of priests and holy and all of this kind of stuff. And at the same time, there's a distinct hierarchy that's being established here in terms of the Kohanim, the Levites, and then everybody else, right? It's why there's a lot of discomfort around that hierarchy too, right? In very traditional Jewish constructs, there's still a prayer that we say all the time to return back, to rebuild Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, and to reinstitute sacrifices, which is why still today in many congregations, certainly across the Orthodox world, and still as far as I know, in at least half of conservative synagogues, although there's been a move away, you still have distinct aliyot during the Torah service for Kohen, Levi, and then everybody else, that there's still this distinct category that's being recalled and remembered so that once the temple is rebuilt, we know who the right people are in order to put to work at it, right? But courtesy of our contemporary, what I would call lowercase l, liberal democratic tendencies in the United States of America in particular, and breaking away from England and the monarchy, there is a lot of discomfort in contemporary Western American values as it relates to hierarchies, that no one should be higher than anyone else courtesy of the who they were born to, right? That this is the meritocracy, the American dream. No matter who you are, if you work hard, you can make it. And whether that's true or not anymore, whole separate question for a different Shabbos with whiskey. But in terms of that ethos, it runs very counter to our lowercase l liberal-minded Western values to think that someone's born and thus they're in a higher echelon or a more holy place than everybody else, which is why in probably about half of conservative synagogues across the country, they don't call Kohen and Levi Elias anymore. They don't do Gilchaning, which is when the priests bless the congregation on the regalim and the high holidays. They've moved away from that because they don't want to be separating people out as Kohanim or Levites anymore. So
if there's something in the human need to look upward to for that glory, that special, those special categories. Isn't it one of the prayers about looking upward toward heaven or to?
Sure. There's no question that we look for dugmaot, examples, models, role models, right? I think my sense is that one of the challenges we have today is that because the temple isn't here, you have lots of priests who are out in the world, Kohanim, who are out in the world, working in business, doing jobs, whatever it is. Not all of them are honest business people. Not all of them are great people. They're not necessarily dugmaot. They just happen to have the last name Cohen or Katz or one of our other, right? And then, but this person's going to get up and bless us a few times a year, right? That's how some people would respond. I'm not saying that's my take, but that's
for some people that are truly exemplary. If we're supposed to be an or lagoyim to the world, should we not be exemplary to ourselves?
It's a great question. I think the contemporarily the question might be, how do we identify those people and we empower them rather than have it be simply by virtue of who they were born to? Right? That would be the question. If we were going to create that construct today fresh, would it be the Kohanim that we have be that for us? Or would it be the people who volunteered at the local food shelter or whatever it might be,
Maybe
right?
it would be a sensitive child who has the ability to see through some of these things.
Sure.
The contradictions, the discrepancies, the hypocrisy and so forth.
Beautiful.
What I don't understand is why God decided to choose the stiff-necked people who went over the derech as his favorite people.
Well, the Midrash says that he tried a lot of other people first. Right? There were a lot of other, there's a Midrash that says that God offered the Torah to lots of different nations. And there's actually, if you think about, there's a story in the Talmud about God basically like taking Mount Sinai and turning it upside down and holding it over the Israelites, threatening to drop it on them. And basically saying, so you're going to be my chosen people, right? Implying that there wasn't necessarily much of a choice in terms of making that choice. Yeah.
I'm going to say that I think another aspect that maybe we read our own situation into, though, is that I think the rabbis have a sense that at least they talk a lot in various parts of the Talmud about the utter corruption among the priesthood, and that the Second Temple is a kind of a disaster because of that. And ultimately we get Sinat Hinam as an explanation, but that's another way of leveling things. Say that the people you put over you are actually inherently corrupt. So we in our generation in America maybe like to look at Lord Acton's famous aphorism then, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Maybe if we were living in a different time, in a different place, we wouldn't be talking about that. I'll take your point on that. But here we are talking about it.
Totally. And yes, please.
I think one reason why Jews became the chosen nation was that, like you said, God presented it to many, many other nations, and they kind of did not accept it so much and so on. And Jews were the ones that said, you know what, all right, we'll take it, but tell us what it is. Whereas all the other ones said, let's see what it is. And why Jews said that? Na'aseh v'nishma, because they were in slavery. And maybe they thought nothing is worse than that. We have already seen that. What could be worse? All right, we take it. Tell us what it is exactly.
Right, exactly. We'll do it. And then maybe later tell us what we just agreed to. Right? Maybe. Good. One of the line to me that I think jumped out the most from Fiddler on the Roof is after Tevye's daughter's wedding gets ransacked courtesy of the pogrom. Tevye turns to the heavens and says, you know, God, I know that we're your chosen people, but maybe once could you choose somebody else? Right? Like it's a beautifully written line, right? That really speaks to the depths and the impact there. Good. Okay. I want to keep moving a little bit. We're not going to get through the whole text packet. Don't feel obligated. You get to keep it, bring it home, whatever. No, but that's any rabbi worth their salt when they prepare a text packet is giving you extra goodies in order to review later when you go home. Okay. So I brought a few commentaries, and we don't have to go through them in complete depth. But I thought that there were a couple that were really worth exploring. Does someone want to read what Sforno says? It's the bottom of the first page.
To render honor and glory to the Almighty through the wearing of such respective garments when performing temple service. 2. Also, the priest should inspire awe among the Israelites, who are all considered his disciples, seeing he had the names of all the tribes engraved on these garments right opposite his heart when he wore them in his official capacity.
So Sforno is commenting on these two words, lechavod ulatifaret, right? And for lechavod, this honor, what is it about? Sforno says that the idea is that we are giving honor and glory to God by wearing very nice clothing. And why the need for this second word, ulotiferet, that we are also inspiring awe amongst the Israelites. Like we talked about earlier, that you're looking up and you see this person and you are in awe of this person, whether again, because they're a dugma or you're someone that they're aspiring to, or just in general. And the reason, the rationale that Sforno gives is because one of the priestly garments is a breastplate and it has all of the tribe's names on it. He's basically our representative to the divine in this way. And thus we want people to be in awe of him as well. Okay, so that's Sforno's take, but what does the Torah say? So we turn it over the back of this first page, L'chavod u'tiferet, for glory and splendor. Someone read this one, please.
Read.
Please.
Glory and splendor. Nachmanides writes that this means that by wearing the garments described forthwith, the wearer would enjoy glory and splendor in the eyes of those who saw him wearing these garments. The reason was that the garments that will be described now were all of the type worn by royalty in the time of the Torah.
So the Torah's take is a little bit different than Sforno's, right? The Torah is saying it's not just that people should be in awe of the high priest. The Torah is actually suggesting that the wearer, meaning in this case, the high priest or the priests, Aaron, right, are going to receive glory and splendor from those who are viewing him. This is a very, very different take than Sforno, who is suggesting that the idea is that the glory and splendor is meant to be for God, right? The Torah suggests actually, no, the glory and splendor is going to be for the high priest, not for God necessarily. And it's because we're dressing you up like royalty, and thus people are going to look at you the way they look at monarchs. Interesting. Okay.
Can't you kind of reconcile them by saying that since those words are used also describing God in other places, and God is the ultimate king, that it still could be said that if you were honoring the high priest because of what he's wearing, you're ultimately also honoring God because
the priest would certainly like you to think so. No, for sure, for sure. And also I want to come back because I remembered what you said earlier was spot on as it related to the rabbis and their discomfort with the priestly class. Don't forget the way that we think about the evolution of the rabbinate is through the Pharisees, right? But the priestly class and their kind of close loyalists were the Sadducees. So ultimately, once the rabbis start to come and assume power after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Sadducee power and influence fades away because there isn't daily sacrifice happening anymore. The priests don't have those roles. The Pharisees, who turn into the rabbis, rise to comparative prominence. And one of the ways that they imbue their own selves with power, authority, and authenticity is by saying, well, we are the inheritors of this from those people who are all corrupt, and thus we cannot trust them to actually come back or do anything anymore.
Therefore tell stories about pelting the high priest with etrogam because of no water libation.
Correct.
Yeah, I often think of what could be a contradiction between a public image and a private image. So if these people, a rabbi, for example, who could give a very magnetic sermon, but whose personal life and family life is tragic, they're not able to apply what they're preaching publicly in their own personal lives. You want to comment about that? Public versus private image probably doesn't get into that here.
It doesn't necessarily get into that here, but we are going to see in just a moment on the Malbim that the Malbim starts thinking about this not just as the exterior, but the impact on the internal for the priest, right? Good. So let's read the Malbim and then let's see if that starts to open up that question for us. Will someone read this? Yeah, please.
Just quickly, is Rob, is that a book of Perush, just like Rashi and Onkelos and so forth? It is it one single book or
no,
series of books?
Volumes.
Volumes and volumes. And it's called Torah Aruch. What is it in English? Just
you look up the tour. The tour.
Thank you.
Yeah, Nelson, please.
I hate to keep raining on the parade, but if you look at recent controversies in American politics, whatever side you take, you can see that the wearing of special garments in someone who you don't trust anyway is somehow scandalous. It's just sort of like they're faking it. And so I think if people didn't trust the priests, the fact that they were wearing special clothes would actually be a negative.
Interesting, interesting insight. Thank you. Can someone read the Malbim for us, please? The middle of page 2. It's a little longer, but it's okay.
You shall make sacred garments. Behold, the garments that God commanded to make were ostensibly outer garments, such that their makeup is discussed, how the craftsmen are to make them with their work. But they really indicate inner clothes that the priests of God should make, to clothe their souls with thoughts and traits and proper tendencies, which are the clothes of the soul. And the craftsmen did not make those garments. But God commanded Moses that he should make these sacred garments, meaning to teach them how to refine their souls and traits in such a way they will wear majesty and splendor upon their eternal soul.
So the Malbim is less interested in the outward impact of the clothing, right? And when we talk about majesty and splendor, or glory and splendor, or honor and or what honor and glory, right? All of these interchangeable words that we seem to be using in these translations, it's pretty evident that it's what's inside that counts. And the hope is that by wearing these physical garments, that will manifest internal change and focus on the part of the person or people who are wearing them. Okay. And I think that speaks a little bit to the point that you were raising as well, right? In terms of how are we making sure, and I think that came back earlier, someone mentioned like literally the physical weightiness of all of these garments, whether that's, you know, the crown and the breastplate and all of these kinds of things. Can you feel that weight and feel that weight on your shoulders? And can that literal physical pressure start mobilizing you to acknowledge and internalize the weight of the role that you're filling for the community and congregation? And does that shape who you are internally as a person?
Back to the question before this is what Moses should make, and the craftsmen make the outer clothes.
Mm-hmm. Right, and it brings that question up, right? Like, is this Moses? Is this the craftsman? Whatever. Don't forget, we just came off the tabernacle construction. Moses didn't build the tabernacle himself, right? So if you think about the rabbis take an approach on this, it's a very evident, like, Moses is being commanded to do it. But there is debate over, did Moses have to do it, or were the craftsmen doing it? The Malbim is suggesting that Moses is the one who is supposed to make these, not the craftsmen.
Moses did the internal thoughts and traits and proper tendencies, not the actual physical clothing.
Beautiful. Good. Yes, please.
Growing up in a household where my father was a Kohen, no garments of office, but he felt very strongly that just having that name put a responsibility on him to live his life in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't need the fancy garments, but when he was in his working years, where sometimes he had to work Shabbos, he would not take aliyot for Kohanim, and he would not duchen. He said, because I'm not in position to offer that to someone else. So I think a lot depends on the individual, what they do with an office that they're given. And with the name or not the name. My name happens to be Kahain, but.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
It sounds like you did a lot of that internal work too.
We try.
Yeah. Yeah, Ivan, please.
And there's in Genesis, there are a lot of instances where clothing is used to deceive. And in fact, the term beged, I understand, means betrayal. So you can, you think of Jacob deceiving his brother with his clothing, and Tamar deceiving Judah, and Joseph hiding from his brothers, and on and on. There's so many examples of how clothing deceives. So this is a contrast. I mean, and this is another take on how clothing can make you grand and give you inner spirit and strength and authority. But it isn't, in Judaism, I think there's a warning about what you see on the outside, as opposed to what's in the inside.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Good. All right, let's turn the page. I want to go to the Talmud text. We're going to skip the next couple. They're there for review later. They're really good. But let's look at Tractate Shabbat 113. This one's longer. Here's what happens when I dive into a Talmudic text. I'm going to ask someone to read. After 2 sentences, I will probably interrupt you. It's not because I think you're reading poorly. It's so that I can provide framing and context for what it was that we just read, so that we don't just go through the whole thing and be like, what just happened? Okay? So it's nothing personal, but does someone want to start reading, please? Please.
And it was taught in the Tosefta, the members of Rabban Gamliel's household did not even fold their white garments because they had others into which they could change. Rav Huna said, if one has new garments into which he could change on Shabbat, he will change into those garments. And if one does not have garments into which he could change, he lets his garments hang down before Shabbat to beautify himself in deference to Shabbat, as it used to be the custom of wealthy people to wear their clothes loosely.
So let's pause there for a moment. Okay, so we have here a teaching coming in from the Tosefta, and we're in a whole section that's dealing about Shabbat, right? So we're in Tractate Shabbat in the Talmud, and there's a teaching here that says, well, Rabbi Gamliel's house didn't even go about folding their garments nicely, right? They're talking about, what do we wear for Shabbat? How do we elevate Shabbat, okay? And the suggestion here is, well, we heard that Rabbi Gamliel's house, they didn't even fold them so that they would look nice, right? It's kind of the equivalent of having them neatly pressed, if you will, right? They didn't even fold them. And Rav Huna says, well, that's fine. It's because they actually had new white garments that they could wear for Shabbat. They didn't have to wear those white garments. They had new white garments. And if you have new, and new doesn't necessarily mean brand new into this context, notice whatever's in bold is the literal translation of the Hebrew Aramaic text, and whatever is not bolded is the fill-in by the commentator, right? So whenever you're studying a piece of Talmud, you also have to be really careful. It's like, okay, great, new, but the word new doesn't appear in the Hebrew text. The implication is that if you have a fresh set of clothes that are not muddied by your day or week to change into for Shabbat, that you're going to do that, right? And if not, it says the person will let his garments hang down. I think of that almost like, I just traveled here from Nashville. I'm traveling for a week. From here, I'm going to Pittsburgh for work for a few days, and then I go home. I have one of those suitcases that you can like fold your suit and dress shirts into thirds, right? In order to travel comparatively lightly, carry on only. As soon as I got to Rabbi Foster's house where I was staying, the first thing that I did was take them out and hang them up, right? And I've also had moments where, it's still a little more wrinkly than I would like. I'll go and take a shower before Shabbat, and I will hang my suit and my dress shirts in the bathroom with me so that it's like a steaming that helps get out wrinkles, right? So the idea here is, if you have something fresh to wear that looks nice, I'm not too wrinkly today, right? If you have something fresh to wear that's nice, thank you, then that's what you'll wear for Shabbat. And if you don't, what do? You go and you hang them up, right? So to me, I love this. I love studying Talmud. And for me, there's like a couple of texts that I love, but this is an example of one that I love because it means that literally 1,500 plus years ago, our forebears knew that if you have wrinkly clothing, what do? You hang it up, right? One of my other favorites is like there's a question that's raised that if you're studying in the house of study and somebody sneezes, do you shout out marpeh? And marpeh means health, the way that Gesundheit or Salud, or what we say now is God bless you, right? Or Libriut, right? To your health, which means that 1500 plus years ago, our ancestors were saying the equivalent of Gesundheit when someone sneezed. Which is really cool. Like, I love to me, those are connective tissue moments where these don't just become names on a page. These are real people who lived human lives and existences much like we do. Okay, so you go and you hang your clothes if you need to freshen them up, so to speak, for Shabbat. Good. But what does Rav Safra say? Want to continue reading for us, please?
Rav Safra strongly objects to this. Doesn't this appear as haughtiness?
So what's the question? One of the things that the rabbis are very concerned about is making those who don't have feel lesser than, right? So if you do have, and you go and you change into your Shabbos finest, aren't you somehow coming across as haughty or showing off, right? Good, let's keep going.
The Gemara answers, since every day he does not do so, and now in honor of Shabbat, he is doing so, it does not appear as haughtiness.
So the idea is that if every day the person is dressing in that way in order to show off, then we can assume it's haughtiness. But if someone is doing it lichvot Shabbos, if they're doing it in honor of Shabbat, the default assumption is we give the benefit of the doubt. They're doing it for Shabbat, not out of a sense of haughtiness. Does that help anyone reframe the way we think about people who get all fancied up for Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur is Shabbat Shabbatot, the ultimate Shabbat. Granted, there are other restrictions in terms of not only eating and drinking, but bathing, anointing, etc., that come with Yom Kippur. Wearing leather, negilat sandal too, right? But food for thought. Good. All right, let's read what the commentary says. Rather,
it is apparent that he is acting in deference to Shabbat. On a related note, the Gemara cites what we learned with regard to the following passage. If you keep your feet from breaking, from pursuing your affairs on my holy day, and you call Shabbat a delight, the Lord's holy day honorable, and you honor it by not going your own way, from attending to your affairs and speaking idle words.
beautiful. All right, so the commentary is basically saying it's obvious that this person is dressing up for Shabbos, and that makes it okay. And then they pull in a quote from the prophet Isaiah that effectively is saying, if you are honoring Shabbat, okay, great, that's our proof text. We know that you're honoring Shabbat by not doing things the way you would usually do it. And thus, if you don't dress up this way every day, you're doing something different to mark Shabbat, that falls in line with the prophet Isaiah's take. Okay, on the next page, the rabbis.
Rabbis derive from the and you honor it, that your dress on Shabbat should not be like your dress during the week, as Rabbi Yonahan would refer to his clothing as my honor, indicating that appropriate clothing is a form of deference.
Okay, so the rabbis are now parsing this quote from Isaiah that was just shared, okay? And you honor it, and you've heard these words before, right? And they're, sorry, I just want to make sure that we're good in there. Good, okay. So the rabbis are saying Isaiah uses these words and you honor it, and they're deriving from this that you should dress differently for Shabbat than you do the rest of the week. It's what, like, there's something visceral for us. It's partially culture, it's partially the high church culture that we've inherited in terms of formality and what that looks like in America. But I found out recently, I went to a shiur by Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik, who is the rabbi at the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in New York, which is an Orthodox institution. And men are not allowed on the bima unless they are wearing a top hat.
Yeah, wearing what?
A top hat. Unless you were wearing a top hat, you are like a bowler.
Or the kippah? No.
No, on top of your yami, on top of the kippah, unless you are wearing an actual hat, you are not allowed on the bima.
On top of the kippah.
Synagogue, before we came, there were also, and I think at the temple, they had to wear morning clothes, things like, they also had specific clothing.
Amazing. And then this one, I think, makes me happy the way that this teaching continues. All right, so the rabbis have derived that our dress on Shabbat shouldn't be like our dress during the rest of the week. So showing up in soccer uniforms to shul, maybe not the best choice, but if you don't wear soccer uniforms all week and it's the nicest piece of clothing you have, right? Think about it. We have very specific, and this can really alienate people. So after Kiddush lunch, we'll talk about the art of welcoming, and this weaves into that, spoiler alert. But think about your Israeli friends. For most of my Israeli friends, a pair of jeans is the nicest piece of clothing they own. So if they come to shul wearing jeans, for many of us, the response is, well, this isn't Lichot Shabbos, right? This isn't honoring Shabbat. And at the same time, they may be wearing the nicest piece of clothing in their wardrobe, and in their minds, they've completely gotten dressed up in order to be here. So who are we to judge them for that? Okay, so data point.
Judge anybody about what they are wearing, but what they are. That's what I said in earlier.
Beautiful, I agree. So let's finish this paragraph because then I want to honor everybody's time, because I'm going to get hooked off the stage in a moment.
Going your own way mean that you're walking on Shabbat should not be like you're walking during the week.
This one makes me happy. I assume many of you have seen the classic movie Young Frankenstein, right? It's not Igor, it's Igor.
Yes.
But he has this thing where he's walking and he's got Gene Wilder behind him and he's like, walk this way. And then you see Gene Wilder copying and walking exactly, so, but the idea here, and it goes more into depth in terms of the construct, but the idea is not necessarily that you have to physically change the way in which you walk, but they do suggest that if you are in the custom of walking the places, that you change the path that you take, that you find a way to make Shabbat different from the everyday. Okay.
If your whole demeanor changes, then to me, that's more important than the route you take.
Sure.
It's the outward appearance and how you're presenting yourself because it is different.
I love it. Beautiful, beautiful. I would say, yeah, yes, and, right?
So you do things differently on Shabbat. Instead of using my right hand to do this, I should use my left hand.
Because I am not technically, I cannot postin on how we feel about the use of technology, but in general, but yes, the way that Chazal, the way that the rabbis of old felt about Shabbat is that it should be this, what, Heschel would call kind of like this sacred place and time, right? That we're meant to view it differently, be differently, act differently. Whatever we do during the muck of the week, we're meant to be in this higher spiritual plane. If you usually read books on your Kindle, read books that are hard copy. If you usually walk in this direction to get to morning minyan, maybe take a 2-block detour because now you are a person of leisure who is enjoying Shabbat and has the time to do so, but maybe not on mornings as cold as this one, right? But finding, let alone setting it aside as special, right? This notion that, if you're in the grocery store on Tuesday and you see the most wonderful red pepper that you've ever seen, that you grab that red pepper, but you don't eat it that day or the next day, you actually save it for Shabbat. The idea being that it may not be good. That's avocado dressing. But the idea being how are we setting aside, elevating, making the day holy and special? All right, let's finish this paragraph. Yeah, please.
I think about this, one of the fundamental things is it makes us more aware of time. We can replace energy, et cetera, but time is so critical because it's not replaceable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Beautiful. All right, let's finish this paragraph.
From attending to your affairs means it is prohibited to deal with your weekday affairs and to speak about them on Shabbat. However, affairs of heaven, those pertaining to mitzvot are permitted.
Beautiful. So again, we should refrain ideally from, so not only about how we are dressing, but also we should think about how we are separating Shabbat and making it special and elevating it. Beautiful. Okay, so we've made it through. There were a couple texts that we didn't get to. That's okay. Thank you for being here. A pleasure to learn Torah with everybody.